My name is Blair. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady, not loud, not dramatic. The one who listens more than she speaks, who shows up prepared, who doesn't need the room to orbit around her to know she belongs there. I've worked in professional spaces long enough to recognize how quickly calm gets mistaken for compliance, and how often competence is treated like background noise when it doesn't announce itself. People usually underestimate me. They assume I'm agreeable, easy, someone who won't push back if it costs them comfort. I've learned that this assumption can be useful, but it can also be dangerous, especially when others start to believe they're entitled to your silence. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or delivering a dramatic downfall. It's about a quieter arc, one that unfolded slowly, internally, and with far more restraint than people expect when they hear the word humiliation. Because this is the truth. I just submitted my resignation after being humiliated by a colleague right in the meeting room. And that sentence, on its own, sounds abrupt. It sounds reactive. But nothing about what I did was sudden. What you're about to hear is a story about pressure that builds invisibly, about the small dismissals that never make it into meeting minutes, about what happens when disrespect becomes normalized, not because it's loud, but because it's allowed to pass without consequence. It's about realizing too late that staying silent can sometimes cost more than speaking up. At a certain point, I understood something with absolute clarity. Having been publicly humiliated in the boardroom, I realized that quitting my job was the only way to preserve my self-respect. Not to punish anyone, not to prove anything, simply to stop participating in a system that required me to shrink in order to belong. This story moves through quiet moments, glances, pauses, decisions made alone at night. There are no raised voices here, no cinematic confrontations. What unfolds instead is a psychological reversal, the moment when someone who was taken for granted stops being available in the ways others relied on, and the consequences of that absence begin to ripple outward. If you're expecting drama, you won't find it. What you'll find is honesty, the kind that's uncomfortable because it's subtle, and because it asks a question many of us avoid. How much are we willing to endure before we call it self-betrayal? Before we go any further, let me ask you gently. Have you ever stayed quiet in a room where you knew you were being diminished simply because speaking up felt riskier than staying? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed my name most often, spoken kindly, almost affectionately, like a compliment that also served as a boundary. Blair is dependable. Blair will handle it. Blair doesn't need much direction. Dependable people are useful, but they're rarely seen. In meetings, I was the one who filled in the gaps. If a project stalled, I was quietly assigned to support. If a presentation needed refinement, my edits appeared overnight, incorporated seamlessly into someone else's delivery. My work moved through the room without my voice attached to it, like infrastructure, noticed only when it failed, which it never did. No one bullied me outright. That's important to say. There were no insults disguised as jokes, no raised voices. What existed instead was a pattern of soft erasure. My ideas would be acknowledged, then rephrased minutes later by someone else. suddenly worthy of discussion. My concerns were labeled practical details and deferred. When credit was given, it landed adjacent to me, never quite on me. I told myself this was normal, that this was the cost of being calm in a culture that rewarded performance over substance. I wasn't there to be admired. I was there to do good work. And I did. Consistently. They saw me as low maintenance, someone who didn't require reassurance or recognition, someone who wouldn't escalate. In performance reviews, this was framed as emotional maturity. You're steady under pressure. You don't take things personally. What they didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to, was how often that steadiness required me to swallow small moments of dismissal. How invisibility, once internalized, begins to feel like professionalism. I sat in the same chair in the boardroom every week, not because it was assigned, but because no one else wanted it. Slightly off center, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be overlooked. I learned the rhythms of the room, who spoke early to claim authority, who waited to echo consensus, who filled silence because silence frightened them. I spoke when it mattered, or at least when I thought it did. But my contributions were treated as connective tissue, not direction. Useful, but not decisive. There was a colleague, only one really, who embodied this dynamic more clearly than the rest. Confident, articulate, visibly ambitious. The kind of person whose interruptions were framed as enthusiasm. When he spoke over me, no one flinched. When I stopped mid sentence, the conversation simply rerouted around me. I didn't confront it, not because I didn't notice, but because I understood the unspoken hierarchy of discomfort. Calling attention to subtle disrespect often makes you the problem, the sensitive one, the difficult one. And I had spent years building a reputation that hinged on being neither. So I adapted. I shortened my sentences. I brought written summaries instead of speaking at length. I let others arrive at conclusions I had already mapped out, knowing they would feel more invested if the insight appeared to be theirs. From the outside, I looked successful, stable role, competitive salary, influence even, in ways that didn't require visibility. Friends told me I was lucky to work with adults, to be in a place without drama. I agreed with them. I believed them. What I didn't realize then was how thoroughly I had been categorized. I was not a threat, not a contender. I was a reliable support, an asset, not an equal. And once people decide who you are to them, they begin to behave accordingly. Boundaries blur, courtesy erodes, respect becomes optional because they assume it isn't required to keep you where you are. At the time, I didn't name this as a problem. I named it as a trade off. And for a long while, I accepted it. But acceptance, I would learn, is not the same as consent. The first time it happened, it was so minor I almost missed it. We were in a midweek meeting, nothing high stakes, just a progress review with 6 people around the table. I had prepared a brief analysis the night before, anticipating questions that hadn't been asked yet, but always were. When my turn came, I began explaining a risk I'd identified, one that could quietly compound if ignored. I was halfway through a sentence when he cut in, not sharply, not aggressively, just a casual overlap, like my voice was background noise he'd learned to tune out. He rephrased what I was saying, only less precisely, and the room shifted its attention to him without hesitation. No one corrected it. No one said, I think Blair was still speaking. The conversation moved forward as if the interruption had been seamless, efficient, productive. I remember stopping mid thought, my mouth still slightly open, then closing it. I remember the exact sensation of heat rising, not anger, but something closer to embarrassment. Not because I'd been wrong, but because I'd been edited out in real time. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that he was excited. These things happen in collaborative environments. I even nodded along, filling in details when prompted, as a supporting document came to life. Later that day, he stopped by my desk and said, Good catch on that risk earlier. It was said kindly, casually, as if the credit was intact, because the acknowledgement existed somewhere in the air, unclaimed and unrecorded. That's how small cuts work. They don't bleed. They don't leave marks you can point to. They leave confusion. They make you question whether you imagined the sting. After that, it happened again. And again. Not always with him, but most often. A pattern began to form. Not loud enough to confront, not rare enough to ignore. When I spoke, my words were treated as draft material. When he spoke, they were treated as conclusions. I began to anticipate the interruption. I adjusted my pacing, compressing thoughts into shorter windows, trying to land the point before it could be taken from me. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. What stayed with me wasn't just the behavior. It was the room's response, or rather, the lack of one. Silence has weight, and every time no one intervened, that weight settled somewhere between my shoulders. I wondered if I was being too sensitive. That question is a familiar refuge. It allows you to doubt yourself instead of naming a problem that feels inconvenient to everyone else. So I took refuge in it. I told myself I was there to contribute, not to compete for airtime. I reminded myself that influence doesn't always look like speaking the longest. I rationalized the discomfort as growing pains, mine. But something had shifted. A line had been crossed so subtly that no one noticed, except me. And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. From that point on, every meeting carried a quiet calculation. Should I speak now or wait? Should I push or let it go? The mental energy this required far exceeded the actual work. But I didn't have language for that yet. I only knew that something had been taken, and I hadn't agreed to give it. The cut was small, but it was precise, and it taught the room something dangerous, that interrupting me came without consequence. Once something happens twice, your mind starts building explanations. The third time it happened, I didn't feel surprised. I felt prepared. That, in hindsight, is how normalization begins. Not with denial, but with adaptation. I began entering meetings already braced for the possibility that my contribution might be rerouted through someone else's voice. I adjusted my expectations before others had to adjust their behavior. It wasn't just interruptions anymore. It was the way my emails were summarized by someone else in follow-up threads, stripped of nuance. The way decisions I had influenced quietly were later attributed to team consensus, even when the direction had been mine. The way my presence was assumed, my absence unimagined. I stayed late more often, not because I was asked to, but because it felt like the only place where my work existed without interference. After hours, my thinking remained intact. No one reframed it, no one diluted it. I told myself this was a focus, dedication. What it really was, I would learn later, was avoidance. I didn't speak up because I could already hear the responses. I'm sure he didn't mean it. You know how fast paced these meetings get. Maybe try being more assertive. The burden, as usual, would shift back to me, to my tone, my timing, my resilience. So I did what many people do when they sense disrespect, but lack a safe container to name it. I internalized it as a personal challenge. Be clearer, be faster, be undeniable. I refined my work until it was airtight. I documented everything. I built contingencies. I stopped sharing early drafts and waited until ideas were fully formed, hoping that precision would protect them. It didn't. Disrespect, once normalized, doesn't require justification. It feeds on permission, and my silence, however well intentioned, had begun to sound like agreement. The colleague at the center of this, he never escalated. He didn't need to. The room had already learned how to respond. When he spoke, people leaned in. When I spoke, they multitasked. When our opinions diverged, his was framed as strategic, mine as cautious. I noticed how often my name was absent from rooms where my work was present, how decisions were made without me, based on frameworks I had built. It felt like watching a version of myself move through the organization without my consent. Still, I stayed. I stayed because leaving felt like overreacting, because nothing big enough had happened, because I had invested years of quiet labor into something that now felt misaligned. And walking away from that kind of investment requires a clarity I didn't yet have. I also stayed because a part of me believed this was temporary. That respect, eventually, would catch up to contribution. That if I kept my head down, the imbalance would correct itself. This belief is seductive. It allows you to tolerate more than you should while convincing yourself you're being patient, strategic, and evolved. What I didn't realize was that patience, without boundaries, teaches people exactly how long they can ignore you. By the time I recognized the pattern for what it was, it had already settled into muscle memory. Not just theirs, but mine. I had learned how to make myself smaller without vanishing completely. I had learned how to absorb friction quietly. And in doing so, I had taught them something else, that I would adapt before they ever had to. There's a moment when you stop asking why something is happening and start recognizing what it is. For me, that moment came not during conflict, but during routine. I was reviewing a project plan that had been circulated without my name on it, despite the fact that I had built the original framework months earlier. No one was hiding this. No one thought it was strange. The omission wasn't malicious, it was habitual. That's when I understood the role I had been assigned. I was the stabilizer, the one who caught errors before they surfaced, the one who smoothed transitions, translated between teams, absorbed uncertainty, so others could appear decisive. My value lay in how little disruption I caused. I was trusted, but not elevated. This role came with expectations. I would be available. I would be flexible. I would not make things uncomfortable by asking for recognition or space. When priorities shifted, I would adjust. When timelines compressed, I would absorb the pressure quietly. When someone else took the spotlight, I would make sure the lighting worked. And because I was good at this role, it became permanent. I noticed how new hires were introduced to me. Blair will help you get up to speed, not learn from, not partner with. Help, support. The language was subtle, but it carried weight. It positioned me as infrastructure again, necessary, but not directional. The colleague who had interrupted me most often leaned into this dynamic effortlessly. He didn't have to assert dominance. The system did it for him. He brought vision. I brought execution. He took risks. I mitigated them. On paper, we were collaborators. In practice, our trajectories were diverging. What troubled me wasn't ambition, it was asymmetry. The assumption that I would always be there to catch what others dropped, without ever being considered for the same visibility or authority. I began to see how my calm had been misread, how my restraint had been translated into consent. People don't question roles that work for them, and mine worked exceptionally well. There were moments when I considered pushing back, asking for clearer ownership, naming the imbalance. But each time, I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Would naming it change anything? Or would it simply mark me as difficult in a system that already preferred me silent? So I stayed within the role, even as it narrowed. What I didn't know yet was that roles, once assigned, are hard to renegotiate. They calcify, and the longer you perform them without resistance, the more others rely on you to keep doing so. By the time I recognized this, I had already been carrying far more than my share. And the cost of stepping out of that role, of disrupting the equilibrium, felt heavier than continuing to bear it. At least, that's what I believed then. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment anyone else would recognize as significant. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary meeting, with an agenda I had helped shape. We were in the boardroom, glass walls, long table, the familiar hum of the projector. I presented a recommendation I had spent weeks refining. I spoke carefully, deliberately, anticipating objections before they surfaced. For a few minutes, the room was quiet. People listened. Then he laughed, not loudly, just a soft exhale, paired with a half smile. I think we're overthinking this, he said, leaning back in his chair. This feels a bit cautious. The word landed heavier than it should have. Cautious. It had followed me for years, always framed as a virtue, now subtly repurposed as a limitation. A polite way of saying small. What followed was worse. He reframed my proposal as an example of what not to do, using my own logic, stripped of context, as a contrast to his more decisive approach. A few people chuckled, not at me exactly, at the tension, at the relief of someone else taking control of the narrative. I sat there, hands folded, listening to my work become a cautionary tale. No one defended it. No one looked at me. The meeting moved on. Outwardly, I remained still. I asked a clarifying question. I took notes. I contributed where invited. Anyone watching would have seen professionalism intact. But something had shifted internally. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was imagining the pattern. I stopped offering myself the comfort of ambiguity. The humiliation wasn't dramatic, but it was public. And it was final. In that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding. This environment no longer had room for my dignity. Not because I lacked value, but because my value had been repurposed into something that served others at my expense. I didn't confront him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't reclaim the floor. I let the meeting end exactly as it would have anyway. But I left the room different from how I entered it. I walked back to my desk slowly. I didn't open my inbox. I didn't vent to a colleague. I sat there and felt the weight of a decision forming, not yet articulated, but undeniable. The shift wasn't about quitting, not yet. It was about no longer negotiating with myself, about recognizing that silence in this context was no longer neutral. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that staying might be the more dangerous choice. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to when the cost of speaking felt unclear. Now, it was deliberate, measured, chosen. I stopped offering commentary in meetings unless I was directly asked, not out of disengagement, but observation. I wanted to see what would happen if I removed the quiet scaffolding I'd been providing for years. At first, no one noticed. Conversations continued, decisions were made, timelines set, but small fractures began to appear. Clarifications were needed later. Assumptions went unchallenged. Risks I would have flagged early surfaced weeks down the line, more expensive to correct. When questions arose, people still came to me. Can you take a look at this? Does this align with what we discussed? I answered them fully, but only when asked. I stopped anticipating needs. I stopped preempting mistakes. To them, this still looked like cooperation. To me, it was boundary setting. The colleague who had humiliated me mistook my silence for a treat. He filled more space. He spoke with more certainty. He leaned into the confidence the room afforded him, unaware that the ground beneath it was less stable without my unseen support. I watched. I listened. I documented. This wasn't preparation for revenge. It was preparation for the truth. I needed to understand the system as it was, not as I hoped it could be. My notebook is filled with dates, decisions, and omissions, not accusations, patterns. I noted where I was excluded, where my work was used, and where accountability diffused conveniently. I wasn't building a case, I was building clarity. Emotionally, this period was quiet but intense. I felt grief for the version of myself that had believed endurance would be rewarded. I felt relief for no longer gaslighting myself into staying comfortable. And beneath it all, a growing resolve. Silence, I learned, can be powerful when it's no longer confused with compliance. Others continued as if nothing had changed. That was the point. They didn't need to know I was stepping back internally. They only needed to keep doing what they had always done. And they did. What they never noticed was how much of the system I held together, not because I announced it, but because I had spent years absorbing complexity quietly until it became invisible even to those who benefited from it most. As I stepped back, I began to see the full outline of what I had been carrying. Processes I had designed informally, never documented because I was just helping. Relationships I had nurtured across teams, smoothing friction before it escalated. Context I carried in my head, why certain decisions had been made, which compromises were temporary, which risks were dormant but dangerous. I started writing everything down, not in a dramatic way, no manifestos, just careful records, timelines, dependencies, decision rationales. I revisited old files, emails, and notes. I mapped how work actually flowed, not how it appeared on org charts. The picture that emerged was sobering. My role wasn't peripheral, it was central, just unacknowledged. I also began learning, quietly, about my options, about contracts, notice periods, and intellectual property boundaries, about what belonged to the company and what belonged to me. I spoke to no one at work about this. There was no benefit in being premature. What surprised me most was how little resistance there was to my withdrawal. No one asked why I was quieter. No one checked in. My absence from discussions was interpreted as efficiency, not disengagement. That told me everything I needed to know. If my presence had truly been valued as a person, not just as output, someone would have noticed the difference. Someone would have asked. Instead, the system continued, slightly off balance, unaware of the weight it was about to lose. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. There is a particular steadiness that comes from understanding your leverage, not in order to use it, but in order to stop giving it away for free. By the end of that period, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires expectation. I had moved past that. What remained was clarity, and clarity, once gained, is irreversible. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I leaned back and thought, so this is it. It came quietly, the way truth often does, when you stop arguing with it. One evening, long after the office had emptied, I sat alone with my notebook open, reviewing what I had documented over the past weeks. Patterns, dependencies, timelines, names that appeared repeatedly in processes they didn't fully understand. Decisions that looked collaborative on the surface, but relied heavily on context that only I possessed. And then I saw it. Not leverage in the dramatic sense, not a weapon, but something more decisive. My absence would create a vacuum no one was prepared to acknowledge, let alone fill. The systems assumed my presence without naming it. The workflows leaned on my judgment without assigning it authority. The organization had optimized around my quiet reliability, and in doing so, had made itself fragile. That realization didn't make me smile. It made me still, because leverage isn't satisfying when you never wanted it in the first place. I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. Clear about what staying would require. Continued self-erasure, dressed up as professionalism. Clear about what leaving would mean. Disruption, confusion, and eventually, questions no one had thought to ask earlier. I also saw something else, equally important. There was no version of this where I stayed and was suddenly treated differently. Not without forcing a confrontation I didn't believe in anymore. Respect, delayed this long, doesn't arrive organically. It has to be demanded or replaced. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time. No music, no distractions, just the quiet weight of knowing this wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about refusing to keep proving myself to a system that had already decided how much of me it needed and how little. The reveal wasn't external. No one else knew what I knew. That was the point. From that moment on, the question was no longer, can I endure this? It was, why should I? And once that question is answered honestly, The rest becomes a matter of timing. People like to believe that major decisions announce themselves with drama, that there is a breaking point loud enough to justify everything that follows. A moment so undeniable that no one can question why you did what you did. This wasn't that kind of decision. There was no final insult, no slammed door, no email written in anger and sent too quickly to undo. What happened instead was something far more unsettling: the complete absence of confusion. By the time I reached the decision point, my emotions had already done their work and stepped aside. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was evaluating. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one evening, laptop closed, notebook open, but untouched. I wasn't making a list yet. I was listening to the quiet that follows when you stop defending a situation that no longer deserves your loyalty. For the first time, I asked myself the question without softening it: what am I actually staying for? Not the version I usually offer others, not stability, not professional pride, not seeing things through. When I stripped those answers down, what remained was habit, familiarity, and a long standing belief that endurance itself was a virtue. That belief didn't survive scrutiny, so I began listing my options, carefully, without judgment. The first option was the one everyone assumes is the most courageous: stay and fight. I could request a formal meeting, lay out examples, name the interruptions, the erasures, the imbalance, ask for clearer authority, visibility, and ownership. On paper, it sounded reasonable, even admirable. But I knew the truth of that path. I had seen it before. Smart, composed people who spoke up after too long, only to be met with polite defensiveness. Explanations, justifications, promises that required further patience. Even if I won, the cost would be permanent vigilance. Every future interaction would be filtered through the lens of having made things uncomfortable. I would be watched more closely, not respected more deeply. Assertiveness arriving late is rarely rewarded. It is tolerated at best. And more importantly, I didn't want to have to argue for my dignity. The second option was quieter and more common than people admit: stay, but disengage. Do my job, nothing more. Protect my energy. Stop caring about recognition. Let ambition dull. Many people survive entire careers this way, telling themselves they are being pragmatic. I considered it seriously. It would be easy, familiar, safe. But when I imagined myself a year later, still sitting in that same boardroom, still measuring my words, still watching my work circulate without my name, I felt something close to grief. Not burnout, not boredom, loss of self respect. That version of me would be intact on the outside, but eroded internally. And once you recognize that erosion, choosing to continue it becomes an active form of self betrayal. The third option was the one I had been circling for weeks without naming: leave. Not as a protest, not as an escape, as a decision rooted in alignment. Leaving meant uncertainty. It meant disrupting routines I had built my life around. It meant walking away from a role I had invested years into, without a guarantee of something better waiting immediately on the other side. But it also meant something else, something I hadn't allowed myself to prioritize until then: coherence. My values and my environment no longer matched. My silence had shifted from strategic to corrosive, and staying in that context was no longer neutral. I thought back to the boardroom, the moment that had crystallized everything, the quiet laughter, the casual reframing of my work as an example of restraint rather than intelligence, the way no one intervened, the way I remained composed while something essential withdrew. I didn't feel humiliated because I had been embarrassed. I felt humiliated because I had been publicly diminished and expected to accept it gracefully. That expectation was the line. Having been publicly humiliated in the boardroom, I realized that quitting my job was the only way to preserve my self respect. Not because leaving would punish anyone, not because staying would destroy me overnight, but because dignity, once compromised knowingly, doesn't recover on its own. I checked my finances, not impulsively, carefully. I reviewed my contract, my notice period, and my obligations. I made sure the decision was sustainable, not just symbolic. This wasn't about burning bridges, it was about crossing one. What surprised me most was how calm I felt once the decision settled. No adrenaline, no fear, just a deep, steady certainty. Some decisions feel heavy because they're forced. This one felt heavy because it was honest. By the time I closed my notebook that night, I knew something irreversible had happened internally. I hadn't told anyone. Nothing had changed externally, but I was no longer undecided. And once that line is crossed, the rest is no longer about if, it's about how. Once the decision was made, everything around me became quieter. Not externally, but internally. The constant low-level tension I had been carrying for years eased, replaced by something steadier and more deliberate. This was not relief. It was alignment. I understood very clearly that the most important phase would be invisible to everyone else. If I moved too quickly, it would look emotional. If I slowed down too much, I risked second-guessing myself. So I chose precision. I stopped imagining conversations that would never happen. I stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. I didn't need to justify my exit in advance. My responsibility was not to prepare them emotionally. It was to leave cleanly. I began with the practicalities. I reread my employment agreement the way you reread something that suddenly matters. Every clause took on new weight. Notice period, intellectual property, transition expectations. I wasn't searching for escape routes or leverage points. I was searching for certainty. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly where your obligations begin and end. At the same time, I began disentangling myself from the invisible work. For years, I had filled gaps instinctively. When something felt unclear, I clarified it. When a process broke down, I fixed it. When two teams misunderstood each other, I translated. None of this had been written into my role. It had simply become expected. Now, I let expectations surface naturally. If someone asked me to take on something explicitly, I did it. Well, on time. If something was merely implied, if I was expected to notice, anticipate, or absorb, I didn't intervene. I waited to be asked. Often, no one did. The difference was subtle but revealing. Small inefficiencies appeared. Follow-up meetings multiplied. Questions arose that I would have answered before they were spoken. None of this caused immediate alarm. It simply slowed things down enough to expose how much quiet maintenance had been happening without acknowledgement. Still, No one noticed me changing. That was the most telling part. I maintained my tone. I remained professional. I didn't withdraw socially or emotionally. I didn't act colder. I didn't act warmer. I stayed exactly the same on the surface, which made my internal withdrawal almost impossible to detect. I also prepared myself outside of work. I reviewed my finances carefully, not with fear, but with respect. I wanted the freedom to leave without urgency. I adjusted my spending, extended my runway, and removed pressure from the timeline. Independence, I learned, is quieter when it's well resourced. I updated my records, my portfolio, my personal documentation, not aggressively, not publicly, just enough so that when the moment came, I wouldn't hesitate. The colleague who had humiliated me continued on as usual. He spoke with confidence, unaware that the conditions supporting that confidence were changing. He interpreted my silence as acceptance, maybe even reconciliation. I let him believe that. There is power in allowing others to misunderstand your calm. The resignation letter came last. I didn't draft it in a rush. I wrote it, closed it, reopened it days later, removed anything that sounded explanatory, removed anything that sounded defensive. What remained was concise and factual, appreciation without sentimentality, closure without invitation. I wasn't leaving to make a point. I was leaving because the point had already been made, clearly, publicly, and without apology. When I finally saved the document, I didn't feel nervous. I felt finished. The consequences did not arrive as punishment. They arrived as friction. At first, it was barely perceptible, like a machine running slightly louder than usual. A few more emails, a few more follow-up meetings. Questions that had once been answered before they were asked now lingered, unresolved, moving slowly from one inbox to another. No one was alarmed. Yet, the organization assumed this was a normal variation. A busy cycle, competing priorities. Someone was out sick. Something had slipped through the cracks. These explanations were comforting because they required no deeper examination. What no one considered was that the cracks had always been there. I had simply been filling them. The first visible delay involved a cross-functional initiative I had quietly coordinated for years. On paper, it belonged to several teams. In reality, it relied on informal agreements, contextual memory, and judgment calls that were never documented because I had always been there to make them. This time, I wasn't. A decision that usually took hours stretched into days, then into a full week. Emails multiplied. Meetings were scheduled to revisit assumptions. People spoke in circles, each convinced the missing piece existed somewhere, just not with them. Eventually, someone asked me to clarify. I responded promptly, precisely. I answered the question as it was asked, nothing more. I did not anticipate the follow-ups. I did not offer adjacent insight. I did not translate implications. That restraint was new and immediately noticeable. The follow-up questions came anyway, just not all to me. They scattered outward, seeking resolution from people who didn't yet realize they lacked the necessary context. Threads grew longer. CC lists expanded. Words like alignment, visibility, and ownership began appearing more frequently. These words are symptoms. They surface when systems lose their quiet anchors. The colleague who had humiliated me in the boardroom continued to lead discussions with confidence. But something had shifted in his cadence. He spoke decisively, then circled back. He asserted direction, then requested confirmation. His emails became more careful, more verbose. Confidence had once been enough. Now it requires support. Still, no one connected this change to me. That, more than anything, revealed how thoroughly I had been categorized. Even as the structure wavered, I remained invisible within it. The idea that I could be a source of intentional withdrawal did not register. I was still perceived as steady, helpful, and peripheral. The system assumed my contribution was automatic. It always had. As weeks passed, the inefficiencies compounded. Deadlines slipped slightly. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to create tension. People grew impatient with one another. Frustration surfaced in polite language. Responsibility diffused. And through it all, I remained calm, responsive, professional. I did not correct misunderstandings that weren't addressed to me. I did not volunteer to fix problems I hadn't been assigned. I did not rescue momentum. This wasn't passive aggression. It was accurate. For the first time, the organization was experiencing the true cost of my absence before my absence was official. And because the loss was gradual, it was harder to name. No one could point to a single failure. There was no villain, just a growing sense that things were harder. By the time that sense became concern, the source was already preparing to leave, and I was nearly ready to make it visible. The moment it became obvious was not loud. It arrived in the form of urgency, sudden, misplaced, and slightly panicked. Meetings were scheduled with less notice. Agendas grew longer. Questions that had once been brushed aside now demanded immediate answers. The same people who had moved past my concerns without comment were now circling them, trying to reconstruct the logic after the fact. What had changed wasn't competence. It was awareness. Someone finally noticed that decisions were slowing down. Those initiatives were stalling without a clear reason. That accountability felt diffuse in rooms that had once moved quickly. And so the search began, not for solutions, but for reassurance. Managers asked for updates that already existed. Leaders requested summaries of work that had been quietly maintained for years. People wanted clarity, but not reflection. They wanted the machine to return to its previous rhythm without examining what had sustained it. By then, it was too late. The conversation's tone shifted. Where there had once been casual confidence, there was now unease. Where there had been assumptions, there were questions. The colleague who had laughed in the boardroom began checking in more frequently, his tone warmer, almost careful. Just wanted to make sure we're aligned, he said once, leaning against my desk. The phrase hung between us. Alignment had never been the issue. Recognition had. I answered politely, briefly. I gave him what was necessary and nothing more. There was no satisfaction in this, only confirmation. Leadership scheduled a one-on-one, not to apologize, to understand. The questions were framed as curiosity, but they carried urgency. What do you think is slowing things down? Is there anything we're missing? I listened. I responded factually. I did not offer myself as the solution. They were trying to fix a system without acknowledging the person who had been holding it together. And because of that, every proposed adjustment missed the mark. What they didn't realize was that the issue wasn't the process. It was a pattern. By the time they sensed something fundamental was at risk, the conditions for repair no longer existed. Trust had thinned, dignity had been compromised, and my decision, long since made, no longer requires reinforcement. You can't restore respect retroactively. You can only recognize its absence, usually when the person who embodied it has already stepped away. The conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon, not because anyone planned it that way, but because Thursday was the only open slot left in a calendar that had suddenly become crowded with alignment meetings. I was invited with a neutral subject line, no urgency, no explanation. I knew what it was. When I walked into the office, nothing felt different. Same glass walls, same muted colors, same polite nods. The environment hadn't changed, but I had, and that made everything else feel slightly out of sync. My manager was already there, seated at the small table near the window. The colleague who had laughed in the boardroom arrived a moment later. He smiled, the kind of smile meant to signal ease, as if familiarity alone could reset what had already shifted. We exchanged pleasantries, weather, timing, nothing that mattered. Then my manager spoke, calmly, carefully. They asked how I was feeling about my role, about the workload, about the recent challenges. The language was neutral, intentionally vague. It created space for me to fill in whatever story they hoped I would tell. I didn't fill it. I listened. I waited. And when I spoke, I did so without emphasis. I said that I had been reflecting on alignment, on whether my values and the environment still matched. I said I had noticed patterns over time that made it difficult to do my best work without compromising my sense of respect. I did not list examples. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I stated facts the way you state weather conditions. The colleague shifted in his chair. He interjected once lightly to explain intent, to clarify that nothing had been personal. Those things move at, that misunderstandings happen. I let him finish. Then I said something simple. I said that impact matters more than intent, and that, regardless of how things were meant, the result had been clear to me for a long time. The room went quiet. This wasn't a confrontation in the way people imagine them. There was no emotional release, no sense of victory, just the steady presence of truth, placed gently on the table, where no one could pretend it wasn't there. My manager asked what I needed going forward. I answered honestly. I said that I had already made a decision, that I would be submitting my resignation. I wanted to ensure a smooth transition, but that my choice was final. There it was. No threat, no leverage, just clarity. The colleague looked surprised, not offended, not angry, just caught off guard, as if the possibility that I could leave on my own terms had never fully registered. He spoke again, more carefully this time. He said he wished he had known, that he would have done things differently. I nodded, not because I believed that, but because the moment didn't require correction. It required closure. I didn't argue. I didn't revisit the past. I didn't ask for acknowledgement. Those things belong to negotiations. This was not one. The meeting ended politely. We stood. Hands were shaken. Doors were opened. When I walked back to my desk, nothing exploded. No alarms, no whispers. Just the quiet certainty that something irreversible had passed. I submitted my resignation later that day, not with shaking hands, not with relief, with steadiness. The confrontation had happened, not in raised voices or emotional declarations, but in the refusal to continue explaining myself to people who had already decided how much of me they were willing to see. And that was enough. I don't measure who I am now by what I left behind. For a while, I thought I would. That I would replay the meetings, the moments, the missed chances to speak differently or sooner. But that impulse faded quickly, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Perspective. Leaving didn't turn me into a different person. It revealed who I had been suppressing. I'm still calm, still observant, still deliberating. Those qualities were never weaknesses. They were simply exploited in a context that mistook restraint for availability. Outside of that context, they returned to their proper scale. What changed most was my relationship to silence. Silence is no longer my default response to discomfort. It's a choice I make when it serves clarity, not when it preserves someone else's comfort at my expense. I no longer confuse professionalism with endurance. I no longer confuse patience with self-erasure. I work differently now. I choose environments where authorship is visible, where contribution is named, where respect is not something you have to earn repeatedly after you've already proven yourself. When something feels off, I don't rush to rationalize it. I pause, I observe, and I trust what I notice. There's no bitterness in this. That surprises people when they ask. Bitterness requires fixation. I don't revisit that chapter because I understand it. It taught me what misalignment looks like before it becomes obvious. It taught me that dignity is rarely lost in one dramatic moment. It's negotiated away in small increments, each one easier to excuse than the last. Most importantly, it taught me that leaving can be an act of self-respect, not failure. I don't need the people I left behind to understand my decision for it to be valid. Their confusion doesn't diminish my clarity. Their regret, if it exists, doesn't define my outcome. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I chose. And that choice recalibrated how I see myself. Not as someone who endures quietly, but as someone who pays attention, responds intentionally, and leaves when staying would require me to become smaller than I am. That, to me, is quiet dominance. Not control over others, but sovereignty over myself. There's a version of this story that people expect. It's the one where dignity is reclaimed through confrontation, where someone finally raises their voice, names every injustice, and forces the room to reckon with what it has ignored. That story is loud, it's satisfying, and sometimes it's necessary. But it's not the only one. What my experience taught me is that dignity is rarely stolen in a single moment. More often, it's negotiated away quietly, through small compromises that seem reasonable on their own. Letting one interruption slide, accepting one omission, telling yourself that it's not worth the tension to correct something this small. Until one day, you realize how much ground you've given up without ever agreeing to surrender it. The truth is, most systems don't collapse because of cruelty. They persist because of convenience, because there is someone willing to smooth the edges, absorb the friction, and keep things moving without asking for acknowledgement. And as long as that person stays silent, the system has no reason to change. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I didn't leave to make a statement. I left because I finally understood that staying would require me to keep negotiating my self-respect in increments so small they would barely be noticeable. until they added up to something I could no longer recognize as myself. Walking away doesn't make you brave by default, and staying doesn't make you weak. What matters is whether the choice you make aligns with the truth you already know. For me, the truth was simple and uncomfortable. I could continue being valued for my usefulness, or I could choose to be valued for my presence, but not both in that environment. Leaving didn't give me closure in the cinematic sense. What it gave me was coherence. My actions finally matched my values. My silence stopped serving others at my expense. And my calm, once mistaken for compliance, returned to me as something intentional and self directed. There is a particular strength in leaving without bitterness, in not needing to be understood in order to be certain, in trusting that clarity doesn't need an audience to be real. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've been telling yourself that it's not that bad, that you're just being patient, that things will improve if you wait a little longer, I won't tell you what to do. I'll only offer this question. At what point does patience stop being a virtue and start becoming self-erasure? You don't owe anyone your endurance. You don't owe a system your silence. And you don't need a dramatic ending to justify choosing yourself. Sometimes, the most powerful decision you can make is the quietest one, made without spectacle, without permission, and without regret. If this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Have you ever reached a moment where leaving, calmly, deliberately, was the only way to stay true to who you are now? Share your experience in the comments. Thank you for listening.